The third method in 1.4 is called completing the square. You will be using, actually, in this course, we will be using it in chapter 2 and chapter 3. So it's important to know how to complete the square. And again, in all subsequent classes, you will be always using this method. So it's needless to say, very important. It looks complicated, but once we understand it, it's really not. It has steps. These steps has to be taken in the same order. So to solve this equation, and then I'll explain to you why these methods are going to work in a minute. The first thing we look at is the coefficient of x squared. If it is not 1, then we have to divide the whole equation by that number a. Then we're going to move the constant to the right hand side. Then we're going to take the coefficient of x, divide by 2 and square. We're going to see what we get from this step and add it to both sides of the equation, and we will see why the left hand side is a perfect square binomial. So we're going to factor it, and then we combine like terms in the right hand side, and then that will take us to the previous method. Whatever we did will end up with a square root property we solve by using the square root property. So before we do the examples, I want to explain in this scratch paper what is going on. If you remember that if we have x plus or minus a squared, so squaring a binomial, and I hope you memorized it from previous classes, or if not, remember it now. This is none other, it's equal to x squared, either plus or minus depending on the sign, then twice the product of these two. So 2ax, the forgotten term. I call that the forgotten term. Students always forget to put that. Plus a squared. And that comes from, if you put them next to each other and FOIL, you'll see that you're going to get ax and another ax, and then you're going to add them or subtract them. So let's talk about this. So what we're doing here, we're starting from this right hand side. Let me take it. Okay, now if I forget about the a squared for a minute, okay, well, let's not forget it. If you look at this third term, this third term is none other than taking the coefficient of x, which is the 2a, dividing it by 2 and squaring it. Then you're going to get a squared. So what we're doing in completing the square is by taking this constant and moving it out of the way, then we are taking the coefficient of x, dividing it by 2 and squaring it. Then we're going to add it to both sides of the equation. Then in the left hand side, you're going to end up with this here, which is a perfect trinomial. Then we're going to factor it by saying it's the square root of the first, the square root of the last, and the sine of the middle. Okay? So let's see it in action now. Let's do this first easy one. Solve by completing the square. In the test, by the way, you will be asked to use a certain method, and you have to use that method. Okay? So the final answer always worth 1 point. So this first step is if a is not equal to 1, but a is 1, so we're fine. We're not going to divide. Move the constant to the right hand side. So let's move this 2 to the right hand side. By moving it, it becomes -2. So don't forget that. Now the next step, you can do it in your head easily, but I want you to have a good habit, and hopefully that's what you're going to do when you're doing the problems on your own. Take the coefficient of x. Don't worry about plus or minus, because we're going to square. Divide by 2 and square. So this is 3 squared, which is 9. Again, we could have easily done that in our head, but get used to this, because in a few minutes we're going to get fractions, and that's going to be hard to do in our head. We'll take the result, which is the 9, add it to both sides of the equation, and now here's what's nice. It says that this left hand side automatically becomes a a perfect square binomial. We forced it. We completed the square. So what is inside? It's a parenthesis squared. And that is, remember, going back from here to here. So what is that? That's always the square root of the first. That's just a way to remember how to do it. The square root of the last and the sign of the middle. So what is x minus 3 squared? It is x squared minus twice the product of these two plus. So as you can see, equal to 7. Now using the square root property, we get, which what we just finished, x minus 3 equal plus or minus the square root of 7. Finally, add 3 to both sides to get x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 7. So that is the square root property. Let's do another one before we get to the fractions, and the fractions are much harder. Of course, you have extra examples I encourage you to look at. Of course, you are going to do that. So again, the coefficient, this is the easy ones when the coefficient is 1, so we don't need to divide. But what we need to do is to move the constant to the right hand side. So it's going to become positive 20. Take the coefficient of x, which is 10. Divide by 2 and square. So this is 5 squared, which is 25. Take that 25 and add it to both sides of the equation. Plus 25 equal 20 plus 25. Add it to both sides of the equation. Now again, left hand side is an automatic complete square. Can you work that with me? Do you remember how we said? The square root of the first, the square root of the last, the sign of the middle. Now 20 plus 25 is 45. Square root property tells me that x plus 5, because it's squared, is equal to plus or minus root 45. And finally, move the 5, so it's going to become negative 5 plus or minus. We have to simplify. The what's inside the square root is 45, which is 9 times 5. 9 comes out as 3 root 5. Okay, again, one more. No, not one more. You try this. I want you try it on your own. Okay, so now we're gonna get to the ones that have a fraction, and these are much harder, obviously, to work. So let's see. I have one worked for you. Please go over it, and I'm gonna do another this one together. So let's do this one. Solve by completing the square. The first step, which is the coefficient of x squared, is not 1. So the first step is to divide the whole equation by 4. So what are we going to get? We're going to get x squared plus 6 over 4x plus 5 over 4 equals 0. But remember, let us simplify, always simplify. So this is x squared plus 6 divided by 4. You can divide both by 2, so this will be 3 halves x plus 5 over 4 equals 0. So we're done with the first step, which is dividing the whole equation by 4. Now let's move the constant to the right hand side. So x squared plus 3 halves x equal to negative 5/4. Here's the next step. I'm going to do it on this side. Take the coefficient of x. Don't do another division. Write it down as divide by 2 and square. And why am I telling you that? To make it easy on you. Now, the division by 2 is the same as multiplying by a half. If anything cancel, cancel. But here nothing cancel, numerator and denominator. So multiply across, you get 3/4 squared. And what is 3/4 squared? Is 9/16. See why I told you to do it on the side. Now take this result add it to both sides of the equation. So we're going to get x squared plus 3/2 x plus 9/16 is equal to negative 5/4 plus 9/16. The minute, guys, the minute you do this step, which is adding the result to both sides of the equation, immediately do this. This way you know that the next step is to factor the left-hand side. This way you don't have to make any mistakes. So, what is inside the square root? The square root of the what's inside the parentheses? The square root of the first. What is the square root of the last? 3/4. The sign of the middle is equal to, now we're going to add, we can't add without having the same denominator, common denominator, so we're going to multiply top and bottom by 4. So what do we get? X plus 3/4 squared is equal to negative 20 plus 9/16, because we did the common denominator, which is x plus 3/4 squared is equal to, subtract negative 11/16. Okay, negative 11/16. Now the square root property tells us that x plus 3/4, whatever is squared, is always equal plus or minus the square root of negative 11/16. Move the 3/4, so it's going to become negative 3/4. Now, plus or minus, the denominator 16 comes out from the square root as 4. And the square root of negative 11 is none other than the square root of 11i. Okay. Again, you have another example here for you to check on, and another example. I made another example also for you, worked out, and then we're gonna do one more together. Okay, guys, one more. Here we go. First step, is the coefficient of x equal to 1? No, divide by 2. So now what do we get? We get x squared plus 5/2x minus 3/2 equals 0. Move the constant to the right hand side. We're gonna get 3/2. Take the coefficient of x, 5/2, divide by 2 and square. So the 5/2 is going to be multiplied by 1/2 and squared. So this is going to be 5/4 squared, and finally 25/16. I'm going to take that and add it to both sides of the equation. So x squared plus 5/2 x plus 25/16 equal to 3/2 plus 25/16. Immediately parentheses squared. What's inside? Square root of the first, square root of the last, the sign of the middle. We need a common denominator, which is the 16, so we're going to multiply this top and bottom by 8. So 8 times 3, 24 plus 25/16. So here we have x plus 5/4 squared equal to 49/16. And now, using the square root property, x plus 5/4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 49/16. Wonderful. So let's see. Subtract negative 5/4 plus or minus, this is none other than 7/4. These are all real numbers. Please, this is not a final answer. Okay, so we have the same denominator, meaning both are divided by the same denominator. So one time we're going to add, one time we're going to subtract. So either x is equal to negative 5 plus 7, which is 2 over 4 or 1/2, or x is equal to, now we subtract, -5, -7 is negative -5, -7. So I'm pausing because I'm not getting the same answer as I thought I will. Okay, no, it is actually. Okay, so it's equal to -12 over 4, and then simplify and you get -3. So we have these two answers. Okay, guys. So what's next for you is, again, I'm gonna tell you to do this on your own, and we will be done with completing the square. Okay? All right.